The race to World First is truly one of the most epic events on the World of Warcraft calendar, a combination of both a marathon and a sprint from the best guilds in the world to see who can be the first to defeat all of the new bosses from the new raid tier. At least, that's what we usually hope that it would be. As you may have recently seen, Liquid's World First defeat of Gallywix in the Liberation of Undermine raid came seemingly out of the blue, with a 100 pull count on what otherwise was sizing up to be a competitive race. Not to take anything away from them, of course, it's a deserved win and it's not their fault the boss fell somewhat short on expectations of what we all know Blizzard is capable of doing. But it got me thinking back to some of the previous Race to World Firsts, whether they were streamed or otherwise. Which ones were some of the most difficult for the best players to overcome? What would be the top 10 hardest end bosses of the Race to World First from their pull count? Well, that is what I want to answer today. So I'm only going to be including bosses where there is some recording of the pull count attempted which I can find and verify. Of course, this is really easy post-battle for Azeroth because everything's been streamed, but in the earlier days of WoW, back when the Race to World First was much more secretive, there wasn't always a clear number of pulls recorded by those pushing the boss. All they would have cared about was getting the World First in the first place, never mind the pull count. But I'll try and include some honourable mentions towards the end of bosses that you might have expected to see, but either their pull count was lower than you would have thought, or we're just not really 100% sure. So with all that said, let's make a start on this. But first, a quick mention to today's sponsor, Go-Go-Muffin. Go-Go-Muffin is a cozy fantasy mmorpg with idle gameplay ideal for mobile players on both iOS and Android. You can take part in a relaxed leveling experience or action-packed dungeon fights, whilst having the option to switch between manual and auto battle. You can also team up with 3 or 5 players in party dungeons, using strategic cooperation between different professions to take down powerful enemies. Go-Go-Muffin has unique mechanics such as baking cat buns using cat fruit wood. Each bun and combination have different effects, and you can equip up to 4 buns in your cat team to gain stat bonuses. Some intend to unlock new mounts and customize them with all types of mount paints. There's also the third class change update too, which increases combat power and introduces new appearances. You can even unlock a new skill pool with additional talent options to refine your playstyle. New to Go-Go-Muffin is the Bugcat Kapu crossover. You can purchase the Black Bugcat family outfit and mount paint series, or complete Black Bugcat's journal to earn the Kapu form outfit, stickers and collab accessories. On top of all that, all you need to do is log in for free rewards like the Black Bugcat family background and Kapu stickers. There is all this and tons more, so if you need a chill game for your downtime, download Go-Go-Muffin via the link below now on mobile and get started today. Many thanks to Go-Go-Muffin for the sponsor today. Let's get on back to WoW. And we'll be beginning at number 10 in Legion with Method's World First defeat of Mythic Argus the Unmaker in the raid and Taurus the Burning Throne, which took a total of 320 pulls to complete over an 8-day duration. Legion was an expansion of extremes. Whilst it had the easiest Mythic raid boss ever in Xavius in its first raid tier, the Emerald Nightmare, it also packed some extremely challenging encounters over its whole duration. And this isn't the last time we're going to be hearing about Legion in this video, believe me. Argus the Unmaker was the final fight of the expansion though, closing a chapter in the World of Warcraft universe that saw a huge return to form for the whole IP. Method at this point in time were very much in their stride and have been claiming many world firsts for quite a while, so they came into this tier as being the favourite to claim another win. That being said, Taurus the Burning Throne as a raid was definitely a step down in difficulty from its predecessor, and once Mythic Week opened up, all but the final boss were defeated in the space of 2 days, leading to a final head-to-head battle on Argus between EU's Method and North American contender Limit. For an end boss during this Warlords of Draenor to BFA timeframe, Argus was more on the tame side, even though it was clearly anything but a pushover, featuring plenty of raid coordination needed, and that one transition phase where the boss just goes all main character and one-shots the raid Lich King style. But unlike Lich King, after you resurrect, you've still got got a lot of work ahead of you. And of course, down the Argus Atoll had the chance to reward the legendary trinket to end all legendaries, Amanthal's Vision, which just gave an incredible amount of stats, and as far as I remember was BIS for just about everyone. Even though Blizzard made it super rare and hard to get, you were lucky if you had this, believe me. Next we're heading back one expansion to Warlords of Draenor, a rather short but also sweet addition to World of Warcraft when it came to raiding, and for all the negatives people can have against Warlords of Draenor as a whole, people tend to agree it did one thing well, and that was raiding. At number 9 it's Mythic Blackhand in the Blackrock Foundry, with Method also claiming this world first with 325 pulls over a 10-day duration. Warlords of Draenor was the first expansion to fully embrace this brand new Mythic raiding mode for all of its content. This new 20-player format was designed for the best players in the world, and it would certainly put them to the test in WoD. Blackrock Foundry was the second raid tier to drop in WoD, featuring some of the most memorable bosses ever, such as Hans and Franz, Operator Thogar, aka the Train Boss, and the marathon of an encounter that was Mythic Blast Furnace. But awaiting the best raiders at the end of this instance was a Warlord of Draenor, Blackhand, and this fight was no slouch on difficulty. As the fight progressed, you would gradually drop down to each new platform, first just fighting Blackhand himself at the very top as debris fell from the ceiling, and then he smashes the platform down one layer and you had to contend with ads up on the rafters, as well as dealing with a host of various war machines while still managing to keep up with the boss's own mechanics. Down one more floor and you take on the final part of this encounter, where the boss would gradually fill the room with dangerous AoE zones. Players had to manage soaking falling debris and managing tight positioning requirements here. It was a true race to the finish, and the first kill by Method just barely scraped by a few moments before wiping. Definitely a worthy fight of the name Blackhand, and a visually impressive one too. Next we're heading forwards quite a few expansions to one of the most modern additions to this list, and that would be Mythic Fyrakk the Blazing and Emir Drasil the Dream's Hope during Dragonflight. The world first of this was claimed by Europe's Echo with 344 pulls over a 12-day duration. The funny thing here is the penultimate boss, Tindral Sageswift, actually eclipsed this pull count and took 435 attempts. There are very few instances of this happening. In fact, Tindral himself will be ranked higher than quite a few M bosses that we still have to talk about. The race on Fyrakk himself was perhaps one of the best showings of how good the race to world first can be, with Echo and Liquid literally battling head to head on single-digit percentage pulls back to back. The encounter itself had all the hallmarks of a difficult WoW boss too. Tons of telegraphs to dodge, strict positioning, baiting requirements for certain abilities, and a dreaded extra action button mechanic for certain players. It had multiple DPS check breakpoints, and it all ended with a race to the finish where Echo were barely able to defeat the boss a matter of seconds before wiping. I really hope to see more race to world first events that can put on a show like this raid tier did, and we can only hope the next one is as good. Now we head back once again all the way to Battle for Azeroth. BFA was the real start of the race to world first as we know it today, where it's a massive event and everything is streamed the whole way through, with Method at the time taking the step to stream its opening raid, Uldir. Before that, everything was a lot more secretive because, of course, race to world first guilds wanted to hide information as much as possible from their competitors. But nowadays we get to watch along and see the progression, and I'm glad this transition happened. Anyways, at the 7th spot is Mythic Lady Jaina Proudmoore in the Battle for Dazar'alor raid. This race to world first was once again won by Method, who took a grueling 347 pulls to clear this boss over a 7-day duration. Battle for Dazar'alor was a unique raid where players would be race changed on different fights to fit in theme with the story of the raid. We'd spend the first half of the raid as Alliance storming Dazar'alor, and then the second half as Horde fighting the Alliance forces. Imagine if it was the other way around and race to world first guilds didn't have the usual Horde racials for the final few most difficult bosses. And yes, the Horde racials were still better for PvE back then. Berserking, for trolls especially, is kinda good. But Jaina herself was an epic multi-phase encounter against a master of frost magic. Starting off on the ship, you had to contend with various position-based mechanics and bombs before you dropped Jaina's health enough, and then the real fight began. You got a short cutscene cutscene and she teleported to the center of a frozen sea battlefield where players must weather the storm and find her to interrupt her cast. Throughout the fight, players had to manage their heat level too, have it drop too low or get hit by certain mechanics, and you turn into a giant ice block which other players would have to break you out of, and you really didn't have the damage to spare for mistakes like this. Midway through the phase, you get teleported back to the entrance again and have to locate the boss within the ice field again, whilst now dealing with a giant water elemental and mirror images that copied her spells, but overall you just wanted to nuke the boss as much as you could. As with some previous encounters, this was another race to the finish moments before wiping, and it was definitely a memorable addition to the race to world first. For number 6, we're staying in battle for Azeroth, and with method too. The next boss here is Mythic Queen Ashara in the Eternal Palace raid. She took method 359 attempts over a 12-day duration to clear, though all the bosses apart from Ashara were cleared in 4 days from release, so she was really the big challenge. Similar to Yggdrasil, this tier also delivered an amazing race to world first to watch, with another head-to-head battle on the final fight, with method versus limit once again, and each of them edging closer and closer to finally scoring a kill. The fight itself was divided up into several parts, and you had a lot of things to manage before you were even really able to engage the queen herself. From the pair of ads at the start of the fight, to managing the wards around the encounter to ensure their energy didn't reach zero, and on mythic mode there would be a giant beam that would split the whole raid in two periodically as well. This fight also had what I can only really describe as being a weak aura mechanic, because I have no idea how you would be able to react fast enough without the help of an add-on. Players would get a command to perform a certain action, such as soak an orb, group up, keep moving, stand still, stand alone, or don't soak an orb, and on heroic mode and above you had to perform 2 of these actions at the same time. So basically your entire raid got 2 of these commands and has mere seconds to figure out where they should be, who they should stack with or not stack with, and what they should be doing, or you're going to begin taking massive damage. In a world without add-ons, you have to imagine this would have caused countless wipes, but in a world with one, there was a big message on your screen telling you what to do. In the final part of the fight, the room starts to fill up with void zones, and it's a race to the finish to see if you could defeat Ashara before you run out of space or just lose too many people. Ashara was one of the most complicated fights we've seen in a very long time, and definitely one of the more challenging end bosses in recent memory. Next, we're heading all the way forwards into our current World of Warcraft expansion, The War Within, and where the Liberation of Undermine fell somewhat short on expectations, the same cannot be said for the first raid of this expansion, Nerubar Palace. Here, North America's Liquid, who were formerly Limit, claimed the world first kill on Queen Ansarak in 404 pulls over a 12-day duration. Nerubar Palace had quite a interesting difficulty curve as well, with a few freebies at the start of the raid, as is often custom with Mythic difficulty, before things really started to ramp up in difficulty on the 5th boss, Brood Twister of Inax, and beyond. Ansarak was a mechanically challenging multi-phase encounter consisting of severe DPS checks, positioning requirements, and even had a mechanic where a player had to run to the center of a circle, which would knock up all nearby players and allow them to avoid a Venom Nova effect, which would otherwise one-shot them. What made this difficult was how punishing just about all of the mechanics were when they went a bit wrong. If you barely missed a DPS check, you were gonna wipe. If you messed up knocking up too early or late, you were gonna wipe. Even if you didn't time your personal defensive cooldowns correctly, it could come back to bite you later on. Ultimately, this was another close race between Echo and Liquid, but Liquid really pulled through on this tier and were able to claim this world first. At the 4th spot, we journey back again to Warlords of Draenor. For an expansion that had 3 raid tiers in total, it was not short on difficult bosses, and in Hellfire Citadel, the player's second encounter versus Archimonde would prove just a bit more challenging than how he had been in Mount Hyjal during TBC. Here it took Method a total of 473 pulls to defeat Mythic Archimonde over a 16-day duration. Well, if Ashara ever felt like a bit of a weak aura check, this boss felt as though it was the origin of that trend in Mythic raiding. Whilst in its own right, Archimonde Mythic was both a lengthy and complicated fight, it featured some mechanics which were just completely unreasonable difficulty-wise to figure out in the amount of time you were given. Perhaps one of the most infamous boss mechanics ever in World of Warcraft Mythic raiding is Wrought and Focus Chaos. Players in the raid are each given a debuff, one of them's named Wrought Chaos and the other's Focus Chaos. After 5 seconds go by, these 2 pairs of players with a debuff will fire a beam between one another. Vanilla. If any pair of players overlapped a beam so they got hit by two separate ones, they're pretty much going to get one shot. Also, this mechanic picked 3 different sets of players each time it happened, so your entire raid has 5 seconds to figure out 3 times in a row that no 2 beams were going to hit the same player. Yeah, good luck with that, by the way. Radio add-ons were developed that would read where these beams were going, so you could easily look and just know whether or not you were safe. And these add-ons or weak auras were very much essential to ensuring that you don't stay forever wiping in this phase of the fight. Apart from Paragon, of course, who figured out a consistent way to do this mechanic with no custom add-on, but that's just Paragon doing Paragon things. In fact, following the Archimon fight, Blizzard removed the ability for players to retrieve this data from the API and essentially made this kind of add-on not work anymore. I mean, it's their fault for creating a mechanic that was this difficult to deal with, but there we go. Mythic Archimon also had a unique Mythic only phase where he would drag all players down into the Nether for the final part of the fight, which brought on plenty of positioning based mechanics and a DPS race to the end before you ran out of room. As weeks went on in Hellfire Citadel, the raid did start to get easier and easier because, as you may recall, the legendary rings were just incredibly overpowered. Also, some of the trinkets in there were especially insane. Either way, it was a hard fought battle for Method, and they claimed this world first. We are now entering top 3 territory. 3 end bosses remain where there is some recording of the pull count that they had to undergo. At the 3rd spot is Heroic Ragnaros from Cataclysm. This world first was claimed by Paragon, who took a somewhat ambiguous 500 plus pulls to clear this boss in a 14-day time frame. Much like Archimon, this was our 2nd encounter with Ragnaros since the good old days of Vanilla, and much like Archimon, he was going to be a bit more challenging. Of course, Cataclysm Classic has now given us the chance to re-experience this fight in all its glory, but what we've had nowadays would have been a far cry from what Paragon had to undergo to get the first kill all those years ago. I can only imagine what their comms sounded like when he just straight up grew legs and got up out of his lava pit. It must be the most iconic heroic Oni phase this game has ever seen. Ragnaros 25 Heroic is a long boss fight though, and a relentless one at that from start to end. Initially, it's about clearing up lava traps so they don't block your play space for later, and ensuring that your raid is spread enough to not overlap any large mechanics. Then of course you have the transition phases where Sons of Flame rush back towards Sulfuras that Ragnaros has planted somewhere in the room, and if any of them reach it, you instantly wipe. It's kind of funny, this submerge phase was a throwback to the original Ragnaros encounter in Vanilla, but oftentimes, at least in Classic, people would just outright kill the boss before he ever got the chance to use this ability. Later still in the fight is dodging lava seeds and clearing up all the adds before they reach a player, and they'll probably one-shot them if they do, before you push towards the heroic only mode phase, which in theory is pretty simple. There's people on fire cleaning duty, the tanks managing when the boss should be walked into the roots, and of course people kiting the living meteors and deciding when they should be brought into the frost patches so that they can be killed. It's just reaching this point would have taken well over 10 minutes of re-progressing the entire fight and playing very well, and if any small thing goes wrong, it can snowball into a wipe very easily. Ragnaros Heroic is definitely one of the most iconic encounters in World of Warcraft history, and over 500 pulls to get him down shows how difficult this fight truly was and how dedicated Paragon were. At the number 2 spot, we're venturing onto a boss where its difficulty is borderlining on insanity. Once again, it was another return from a boss that had already been fought during World of Warcraft, with his first appearance being the final boss in the Sunwell raid during the Burning Crusade. And once again, his second appearance was going to be a bit more challenging. This is of course Kil'jaeden and Mythic in the Tomb of Sargeras from the Legion expansion, a boss that took Method 654 attempts to clear over a 19-day duration. The Tomb of Sargeras was a raid with an absolutely absurd difficulty curve. It had plenty of free bosses towards the start, and then you got towards the end and things just went wild. In fact, Tomb of Sargeras has the highest collective pull count between all bosses of any race to world first ever, with around an estimated 1,250 pulls to clear the entire raid. Another fun fact is that the penultimate fight of this raid, Fallen Avatar, had already taken Method 454 pulls, so you better believe they were going to be feeling the burn before they even got to kill Jaden. But then of course they got to kill Jaden, and where do you even start with this fight? I think the key phrase for kill Jaden is overlapping mechanics, each of which are pretty simple in their own right, but then they start to cross over one another and things begin to get extremely complicated, and honestly at one point were borderline not possible. Method was 6 days deep progressing on this fight before Blizzard actually had to step in and nerf him, changing mechanics, timings, and tuning down his damage on certain abilities. But this was still far from an easy encounter. Overlaps included needing to soak Armageddon circles that would one-shot the raid if you missed one. You could also be getting knocked back during this happening, splitting damage from a blast targeted on one player whilst moving out with a huge AoE zone, and so much more. To talk a bit more about these knockbacks, there were orbs called rupturing singularities that would spawn at the edge of the room. On lower difficulties, these knocked you back a little bit. On Mythic, they straight up knocked you from one side of the platform to the other, and you had to be pretty much underneath it in order to survive. In fact, this knockback was so difficult to deal with for classes that lacked mobility that to counter it, some classes, such as priests, had to reroll Goblin for their rocket boot racial, which enabled them to hop forward a short distance after getting knocked back. But wait, there's more. There's an intermission where you have to find Illidan somewhere in the darkness to grant you sight. After he's given you sight, you need to gather ads up and AoE them down very fast before they overwhelm you. Oh, by the way, during this complete darkness, the knockbacks are also happening, and you just need to know when they're going to occur so you can counter them with a movement ability. And the final major phase saw pillars spawn, which fired beams between them, and you had to locate a safe spot. And there was also an orb that had to be kited to the side of the room, whilst there was constant ramping raid-wide damage on top of that. This fight, in my opinion, was the most difficult WoW encounter that we've ever seen, even though it's not quite at the top of the list, and that remains true even in its post-nerf state. Kill Jaden Mythic had absolutely everything. It had DPS checks, overlapping difficult mechanics, positioning requirements, target priority, personal responsibility, needing to perform mechanics non-verbally due to time constraints, and so much more. I wish Method streamed the Race to World first back then, to be honest. This would have been a spectacle to behold with just how obscenely difficult it was. Nevertheless, there is one end boss remaining that took even more attempts than this to finally defeat. But first, as promised at the start, we have a few honourable mentions of notoriously hard bosses which you might have expected to see but are absent from this list. First up is Paragon's defeat of Lich King 25 Heroic, which they estimated around 170 pulls. There was still the attempt system back then where you could only wipe 50 times per reset between the 3 end of wing bosses, so this somewhat capped how much they could bash their head against this legendary fight. Still, this might be a lower number than you expected. Next honourable mention is Garrosh 25 Heroic, which was killed by Method. I found a post where Method member Nox claims that this boss took them around 272 attempts. Garrosh was a seriously long encounter, so this was probably more than enough for them at the time. Also, this fight famously ended up with just their paladin tank left standing, which is a truly epic moment. The final honourable mention is Yogg 0 World First by Guild Stars. Now, there are posts online floating about claiming 500 plus attempts to get this boss down, but there's nothing confirming that which I can find from any Stars member themselves. And they even did put out a detailed post after having defeated the boss, which was translated to English, and it just doesn't mention their pull count. As such, I really couldn't include it here, but at the number 1 spot, what is statistically the hardest WoW end boss ever via pull count is a boss from Battle for Azeroth. This was Mythic Unat in the Crucible of Storms that took European Guild pieces an astounding 731 attempts to finally get down over a 10-day duration. So whenever Unat is brought up, you do have a few extra bits to mention. First is that the Battle for Dazara lore progress took place about 3 months prior to this raid, and the Race to World First guilds can usually plan around major tiers a good while in advance. But this smaller 2-boss raid in the Crucible of Storms came out of the blue, and no one expected it to be anywhere near as difficult as it was. A limit who had been very much on Method's tail in the prior raid tier just decided not to race Crucible, so that was one serious contender out, and the Mythic Dungeon International was also happening, so plenty of top end players were already tied up competing in that. Nevertheless, Pieces were a top performing guild in their own right, being top 5 in the Race to World First in all all tiers of BFA except Eternal Palace. And if you look back through this video, you'll realize that BFA was not an easy raiding expansion. In fact, Method, whose kill came merely a few hours later than Pieces, took 751 attempts to get this monster of a boss down. So what was the deal with Unat then? Why was he so difficult? Well, for example, he brought back the infamous mechanic from Nighthold, which is often known simply as the Star Auger mechanic. This would give various people in the raid an icon over their head, and they have several seconds to find a player with a matching icon, or they would explode and wipe the raid. And if you walked over somebody with a different icon, you'd also explode and wipe the raid. And the room got smaller as this fight progressed, so you had less and less room to deal with this raid-wide one-shot mechanic that could be caused by one person's error. You also had to manage certain relics throughout this fight, which would give players powerful bonuses, but these could also be misused and could even wipe the raid if used at the wrong time. Unat was also absurdly melee unfriendly. Pieces brought one Demon Hunter because they put a 5% magic damage debuff taken on the boss back in BFA. This was both because of the Star Auger mechanic I just mentioned, as well as one of the relics, the Tempest Caller, being needed to kill ads, and it was just much easier if no melee were in the way. You'll also notice all these Elemental Shamans they were stacking from their comp screenshot. Elemental was good in its own right then, of course, but they also had a rather unique interaction in this fight. So of course back then Shamans had Ankh on a 30-minute cooldown which would allow them to res themselves. However, this cooldown didn't reset after an encounter ended, but for Unat the tuning was so tight that for each of these pulls, Pieces really needed those Ankhs available to make their tactic work. So they found what can be best described as a clever use of game mechanics to ensure this cooldown was up without having to wait some 30 minutes between each of their 700 plus pulls. They found the Morozond encounter over in the Endtime dungeon from Cataclysm has an hourglass that can be clicked during the fight which resets all of your cooldowns. This for some reason included Ankh, so they did an attempt on the boss, failed. The Shamans got summoned over to Endtime to reset their rank, get summoned back to the raid, and go again. It's crazy what a world first takes, right? But that's about it, the 10 most challenging raid bosses in WoW's history via their attempts needed before a kill was landed. Hopefully the next tier from the War Within and the rest of the World Soul Saga provide some good Race to World First content, as when it is two of the best guilds going head to head on a boss, it is always a great watch. Let me know if you've ever progressed any of these bosses, or whether there were any other encounters you expected to see here that are absent in the comments down below. And, as always, thank you so much for watching and listening in, and I'll see you on the next one very soon.